Hello, welcome back to the YouTube channel of Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley. I'm Pastor Gervais Charnley. This is another Shropshire church. This is the church of St Margaret's, Clee St Margaret's. Obviously the dedication and the village name go together. This church is 12th century. It was connected once with the little chapel at Heath, which, God willing, will have been the previous video. And both of them belonged to the priory at Much Wenlock. The church shows some signs indeed of Anglo-Saxon work, herringbone masonry in the chancel. But the nave appears to be very largely 12th century. The chancel arch is interesting. It's transitional, that is, it's late 12th century. And, well, we'll see when we have a look. So let's have a look around this tiny little Shropshire village church. As usual, of course, we start at the west end at the back. Like so many village churches, and unlike Heath, there was a major restoration here in the 19th century. However, that restoration was rather like that at Tugford, in that it didn't change the building very much and retained many of the existing furnishings and features. Rather like Abden, however, most of the windows have been replaced. We have, first of all, this font. Now, this is the top of a 12th century chalice-type font. It's a later 12th century type of font. And you can see why it's called a chalice. It does look like a cup with a wine glass with a stem and a bowl. And unlike later ones, the bowl actually is very much a bowl. It's still quite big, of course. We have the war memorial. It's a type that you see sometimes, the windowsill carved with the names of the people of the men who lost their lives in the Great War. The rear seating is Victorian, but the seating forward of the porch, there's a door. That door is about 700 years old. So looking very, very good for the time. But these seats are easily 15th, 16th century. They've been restored. They're very much like the ones at Tugford, indeed. Here we have a print of the church as it was before it was restored. So this is the church that looked in 1790. When we go outside, we'll see that it's got a new belfry and the porch has been restored. Some of the windows have been altered, which is understandable. You want it to look its best, don't you? So pulpit is 17th century, similar to that at Heath, indeed, and quite probably, in fact, by the same man, by the same probably local joiner. And again, the doors in the chancel arch, and this is very much a Norman style arch, although it's transitional, so it's pointed. And that's why you've had these two squints, these hagioscopes added, because otherwise the people in the pews couldn't see anything really going on in the chancel. Now, that's all right if you don't have pews, but once you've got the pews and people are sitting here, you need to be able to sit here and look through that hole. And so this is actually quite a common arrangement where you still have these narrow Norman chancel arches. Here we have Edward Millichap, freeholder late of this parish, died July the 8th, 1807, aged 86 years. Susanna, wife of Edward Millichap, died January 22nd, 1839, aged 85 years. So she's over 30 years younger than him. But the faith she chose, the life she led, commends the best of wives, of parents, neighbours, friends. And yes, there's this really nice, it would have been part of a 2 or 3 decker, but it's now on its own with its little wrought iron lectern. The gates, it's a very sort of Laudian thing that Archbishop Ward was in favour of, that you have gates so that people can't just rush willy-nilly into the chancel. The red painted wall here is unusual, but not unique. There's no piscina, but there is a sedilia there. There's a photograph of Her late Majesty the Queen. I remember going to another Shropshire church a couple of years ago, and it was the death of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Here we have the east window, simple lance. It obviously has been altered, but not that much. And we've got Behold the Lamb of God, a crucifixion see, and a single, that's an original window, Norman type window. Aumbry is just a cupboard, just a fancy word for a cupboard. And again, here we have the squints, the hagioscopes as they're called. Hagios, of course, holy, and scopos, to see. They allowed people to see what was going on in the chancel, which is very important, of course, because seeing the elevation of the host, the consecrated wafer, was what constituted attending Mass. And if you missed Mass, that was a mortal sin, as regarded as a mortal sin. See how thick the wall is here. It's very typically Norman that you've got this layer of the core of the wall is visible, basically. And back into the... Oh, before we do that, actually, we have here 1639 church wardens, so that tells us when that pew was set up, the 1639. And as I say, I think it says 1639. It appears to be somewhat sideways, which would not be unusual. And nice roof timbers, old medieval roof timbers here. We've got a bell cot at the west end, and you can see here we've got these are zinc. These are metal plates that are screwed or otherwise affixed to the wall. And the style is very, very common. You find them in lots and lots of churches. They were mass-produced, basically, and if you had to have your commandment boards, and you just have to have your commandment boards. It's notable, actually, that commandment boards have survived here. In some places they were taken out, but here we've still got the commandments either side of this little chancel arch. Obviously the head over the arch is Victorian. So that's the inside of this tiny little, I mean, it's not the smallest we've been to today, but it's a very, very small little church. That's the inside. Let's back to the chalice font. So that's the inside. We'll now have a look around the outside. And again, bear in mind that print. So I'm going to just have a look at the print there. There we are, that print. That's what it looked like at the end of the 18th century. That's what it looked like a bit over 200 years ago. Before we go have a good look outside, this is inside the porch. This is a very simple example of a 12th century doorway. You can see there that door with things pinned to it, because that's what they did. That's why Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg. He wasn't actually doing anything shocking. It was the content of the theses that were the issue, not the theses not the act of nailing them. And so here we are outside here, and there's somebody's dog doing what dogs do. Let's find another site to start this, because barky dog. Having got more or less away from the dog at Church House, it's still creating. Have a look around the outside now, and we'll come back and conclude things. So first of all, the east end, and here you can see this herringbone masonry, as it's known, and this is about 1,000 years old. It's a sign of Anglo-Saxon and very early Norman, because of course it's the same masons. It's not that the Normans bring over a whole load of masons to do all the village churches. A lot of the masons are actually existing Anglo-Saxon ones. We ignore the dog at Church House, but you can see the simplicity here. That little window there, that's one of the original windows. The original east window would have been like the one at Heath. You can see here the side windows here in the nave. Nave windows have been changed by the Victorians. Got a nice big Victorian vestry. And one of the reasons for that was that prior to this, the clergy would very often just walk to church in their outfits, in their cassock and surplice. Now you can see the Victorian bell cot, which is much more elegant than the previous weatherboarded example that we saw on the print inside. Vestry, it's all Victorian, the vestry. Around here, around to the west end, and we'll go down the hill. So it's a lovely location. This is a a thriving village in some ways, and the church is very much in the middle of this thriving village, so very different from the previous ones we've seen, which have been either shrunken villages or at Heath. What village? At Heath, when this was built, Heath was a big village as well. So you can see where they've had to do a drain under the vestry because the vestry's been built onto the existing building, and they've got to adapt to the state of the building rather than being able to change all the drainage. And again, we've got this window, that's sort of a war memorial window there. And then as we proceed out, there's the church house there, and these are medieval windows. We've got this one here and that one there, and again you can see some of that herringbone masonry there in the chancel. And there's the priest's door, which obviously is not used anymore. It hasn't been used for a very long time, because after all, they don't really need to use it, especially not when the minister has a vestry instead. And so here we go. That's Clee St Margaret's. Another one of these little buildings all scattered around the fringes of Clee Hill. You've got all these little medieval churches, many of them Norman like this, that have had a quiet existence. You can see some of the 17th century fittings in there, some pre-Reformation fittings, Victorian restoration. So much of the history. I mean, one of the good things about this sort of restoration is that, first of all, it's been done by competent people, and secondly, it's been done by people who have kept something of the history of the building in terms of the seating, while adapting the building, and not just the seating, the pulpit and those doors, while adapting the building for Victorian ideas of worship. There's nothing wrong if you have a good restoration by a decent architect. The problem very often is you get these restorations that are done by some local builder who hasn't really got much idea what he's doing, and ends up simply wrecking the building and gutting it and buying in some cheap pews. But here we have a restoration that probably didn't cost a huge amount, but it's one that's left the building still very usable, and compare and contrast with Heath, which is what the building would have, certainly some of the fittings would have been very much like Heath before the restoration. Of course, some of the fittings we can see there are very much like Heath. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and keep you until next time.